A small, pale boy, clutching a worn teddy bear with one button eye, shuffled through the opulent waiting room of the city's most exclusive private clinic, the Sterling Medical Pavilion. His clothes were neat but faded, a stark contrast to the designer suits and shimmering jewelry that filled the space, worn by people who spoke in hushed, important tones. He stopped in front of a woman staring blankly out the panoramic window. Her own attire, a simple gray cardigan over a white t-shirt, elegant in a way that spoke of quiet, unshakable confidence. "Excuse me," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly, a feather-light sound in the heavy, silent room. "Can I sit here?" The woman, lost in her own world of grief and quarterly reports, turned to look down at the child. She had no idea this frail boy was about to breach the impenetrable walls she had built around her heart. What happened next would not only change his life, but would resurrect a part of her she thought was gone forever. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers, so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The woman, Eleanor Vance, had not truly seen another person in 2 years, not since her husband, Richard, had passed away. She saw figures, employees, obligations, but she did not see people. Her world had become a series of muted colors, a landscape of responsibilities she navigated with the same practiced efficiency that had made her a titan in the world of technology. She had built an empire from the ground up alongside Richard, their minds a perfect synergy of innovation and strategy. Now, she was just the solitary monarch of a kingdom that felt hollow. She had come to the clinic for a final consultation, the last step in a philanthropic gesture that felt more like a transaction than an act of charity. Her company was planning to acquire and heavily fund the Sterling Pavilion's pediatric oncology wing, a decision made by her board and approved by her with a detached nod. It was a good business decision, a public relations victory, and a way to honor Richard's memory. He had always been the one with the real heart, she thought bitterly. He would have been here, not just as a benefactor, but as a presence, talking to the nurses, smiling at the children. She was just signing the checks. Her gaze, initially distant, focused on the small boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. His hair was thin, and his skin had a translucent quality that spoke of long days spent indoors. But his eyes, large and startlingly blue, held a depth of sincerity that pierced through her fog of indifference. He wasn't looking at the empty chair beside her as a simple place to sit. He was asking for permission, a small courtesy in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. She saw the slight tremor in his hand as he clutched his bear, its worn fur a testament to countless hours of silent comfort. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Of course," she said, her voice rusty from disuse in any personal context. The boy offered a small, grateful smile that seemed to momentarily illuminate his tired features. He carefully climbed onto the plush leather armchair, his small feet dangling a few inches from the polished marble floor. He set his bear, which he seemed to call Bartholomew, on his lap and sat with a formal straightness, as if determined to be the perfect neighbor. They sat in silence for a long moment, the quiet between them different from the oppressive silence of the rest of the room. It was a shared space, an unspoken acknowledgement of each other's presence. Eleanor found herself turning away from the window, her attention captured not by the bustling city below, but by the small, quiet universe that had just seated itself beside her. She noticed the way he periodically patted his bear's head, a reassuring gesture that was both heartbreaking and endearing. He did not fidget or complain. He simply sat, radiating a sense of patience that was profoundly adult. It was this quiet dignity that finally compelled her to speak again, to breach her own self-imposed isolation. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. The boy turned to her, his blue eyes wide. "I'm Leo," he replied. "And this is Bartholomew." He held up the bear as if making a formal introduction. It was the first time in a very, very long time that Eleanor had felt the genuine, uncalculated impulse to smile. The smile that touched Eleanor's lips was a fragile thing, a ghost of the warmth that had once come so easily to her. She looked at the one-eyed bear, Bartholomew, and then back at Leo. "It's a pleasure to meet you both," she said, her voice a little clearer this time. The boy seemed to relax, his small shoulders slumping just a fraction. The formal tension of the waiting room, with its silent, assessing glances and air of immense wealth, seemed to melt away in their small corner. For the first time, Eleanor took a proper inventory of her surroundings, not as a potential investor but through Leo's eyes. She saw the intimidatingly high ceilings, the cold, modern art on the walls that offered no comfort, and the other occupants who seemed to be surgically attached to their phones, their faces illuminated by the cold blue light of stock tickers and urgent emails. They were all trapped in their own bubbles of self-importance, oblivious to the small drama of life and hope unfolding right beside them. It was then that a man in a sharply tailored suit, his tie held in place by a gleaming silver clip, began to walk his patrol. He was not a doctor, but he carried an air of authority that was just as potent. His name was Mr. Harrison, the clinic's director of patient relations, a title that was a cruel misnomer. His primary function, as far as anyone could tell, was to ensure the clinic's atmosphere of sterile exclusivity was never compromised. He was a gatekeeper of the highest order, and his gaze was a finely tuned instrument for identifying anything, or anyone, that seemed out of place. His eyes scanned the room and settled, with predictable precision, on Leo. Eleanor saw the subtle shift in his posture, the slight tightening of his jaw. He changed his trajectory, his polished shoes making no sound on the plush carpet, as he moved towards them with the predatory silence of a shark. "Good morning, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced veneer of courtesy. He acknowledged her first, a calculated move to establish his awareness of the room's power dynamics, but his eyes were fixed on the small boy beside her. "I trust everything is to your satisfaction." Eleanor simply nodded, her gaze turning cold. She knew this type of man. Richard had always called them empty suits, men who confused procedure with purpose and status with substance. Mr. Harrison then turned his full, undivided attention to Leo. He did not kneel or soften his tone. He loomed over the armchair, a towering figure of condescension. "And who is this?" he asked, his question directed at the air somewhere between Eleanor and the child. "Are you lost, young man?" Leo shrank back into the chair, his hand tightening on Bartholomew's arm. He looked at Eleanor, his blue eyes clouded with confusion and a flicker of fear. "No, sir," Leo said in his quiet voice. "I'm waiting for my mom. She's with the doctor." Mr. Harrison's smile was thin and without a trace of warmth. "I see. And you have an appointment? Here? In the pavilion?" The emphasis he placed on the last two words was unmistakable. It was a verbal velvet rope, a clear insinuation that Leo did not belong on this side of it. The faded quality of Leo's clothing, the well-loved state of his teddy bear, had been translated in Mr. Harrison's mind into a simple equation: not one of us. "People can't just wander in here," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if he were sharing a distasteful secret with Eleanor. "We have a certain clientele. It's for their comfort and security." He made a small, dismissive gesture towards Leo, as if he were a piece of litter that needed to be tidied away. Eleanor felt a surge of something hot and unfamiliar in her chest. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced since a rival corporation had tried to poach her lead engineer. It was righteous indignation. She had spent 2 years in a state of emotional hibernation, but the sight of this smug, arrogant man belittling a sick child had finally, mercifully, woken the dragon. Eleanor placed a calming hand on Leo's small shoulder, a silent message of reassurance that she was there and she was not going anywhere. The boy glanced up at her, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of hope that extinguished the fear Mr. Harrison had so callously ignited. She then lifted her gaze to meet the director's, and the look in her eyes was one of chipped ice. It was the same look that had made hardened corporate raiders fold during hostile takeover negotiations. For a moment, Mr. Harrison seemed to falter, the practiced smile on his face flickering like a faulty fluorescent light. He was accustomed to deference, especially from the clinic's wealthy patrons. He had miscalculated, assuming Eleanor would share his disdain for the common boy who had dared to enter their gilded sanctuary. He saw her simple attire and quiet demeanor as signs of someone who, while wealthy, was likely unassuming and non-confrontational. He had catastrophically misjudged the woman who could buy and sell his entire world before her morning coffee grew cold. "This boy," Eleanor began, her voice low and steady, each word perfectly enunciated and carrying an immense weight, "is my guest. He is bothering no one. In fact, his presence here has been the only pleasant part of my morning in this otherwise sterile and unwelcoming environment." The directness of her statement, and the undisguised criticism of the clinic's atmosphere, seemed to stun Mr. Harrison into silence. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He was a man who operated on a script of platitudes and veiled insults. And she had just thrown the script into a fire. He looked around, perhaps for support, but the other occupants of the waiting room were now watching, their curiosity piqued. The silent tableau of the powerful man, the quiet woman, and the small boy had become the morning's central drama. Harrison, recovering his composure, resorted to his primary weapon, condescending bureaucracy. "I understand, Ms. Vance," he said, his tone shifting to one of feigned sympathy, as if dealing with a well-meaning but naive woman. "It's very kind of you, but we have procedures. The main waiting area is just down the hall. It's much more suitable. I can have a nurse escort him. We wouldn't want him to feel uncomfortable around all of—" He gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings. "This." The implication was clear. The boy was a stray puppy who had wandered into a palace, and for his own good, he needed to be returned to the alley. Leo, hearing this, clutched Bartholomew even tighter. He wasn't just afraid anymore, he was humiliated. His lower lip trembled, and he tried to make himself smaller, to disappear into the vastness of the leather chair. He understood, with the painful clarity of a child who has known hardship, that he was being judged. He was being told, in no uncertain terms, that he was not good enough. Eleanor saw the boy's shame, and her anger solidified into something cold and immensely powerful. It was a resolve she hadn't felt in years. She was done being a passive observer in her own life. Done with the fog of grief. This small boy, with his quiet courage, had reminded her what it felt like to fight for something. "He is not uncomfortable," Eleanor stated, her voice dropping even further, taking on a dangerous edge. "You, however, are making him feel unwelcome. You are making me feel unwelcome. Is it the policy of the Sterling Medical Pavilion to judge its patients based on their clothing? Is compassion a service that is only offered to those who arrive in a limousine?" Her questions hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. She was no longer just defending Leo, she was cross-examining Mr. Harrison. And the entire waiting room had become her jury. The blood drained from Mr. Harrison's face. He was a man who lived and died by the perception of the clinic's elite clientele. To be so publicly and eloquently admonished by one of them, in front of others, was his worst nightmare. He had built his career on being an expert reader of the wealthy, on knowing how to flatter, soothe, and segregate. But Eleanor Vance was an entirely different species. She did not care for the performative dance of status he had perfected. She cared about substance, and she had just found his to be severely lacking. "That is not our policy at all, Ms. Vance," he stammered, his professional veneer cracking to reveal the panicked bureaucrat beneath. "We pride ourselves on our discretion and our world-class care for everyone." The words sounded hollow, a desperate string of corporate buzzwords that held no meaning in the face of his actions. Eleanor raised a single skeptical eyebrow. "For everyone? Or for everyone who can afford your exorbitant fees and passes your sartorial inspection?" She countered, her voice relentless. "This child is here because he is sick, he is in a place of healing. And your first instinct is to treat him like a trespasser, because his shoes are not made of Italian leather. You speak of comfort and security. Whose comfort? Yours, or the comfort of a child who is likely facing something far more terrifying than your disapproval?" The other people in the waiting room were no longer pretending to be engrossed in their devices. They were watching openly now. Some with expressions of mild shock, others with a dawning sense of shame. They were complicit in the culture Mr. Harrison was enforcing, a culture of silent judgment and exclusion. A young woman in the corner, who had been anxiously tapping at her tablet, slowly lowered it. Her eyes fixed on Leo with a look of profound sympathy. She was the kind witness, the first juror to be swayed. "My mother says politeness doesn't cost anything," Leo whispered, his voice small but clear in the suddenly silent room. He wasn't speaking to Mr. Harrison, but to Eleanor, a simple declaration of a value he held. The statement, in its profound simplicity, was more damning than any of Eleanor's pointed questions. It was the truth, pure and unvarnished, from the mouth of the one who had been wronged. It drew a sharp, undeniable line between the boy's innate decency and the man's manufactured superiority. Mr. Harrison looked as though he had been physically struck. The child had not only embarrassed him but had exposed the absolute bankruptcy of his character. He opened his mouth to respond, perhaps to offer a weak apology or another bureaucratic excuse. But at that exact moment, a woman in a simple coat and worn-out sneakers hurried into the waiting room, her face etched with worry. "Leo!" she cried out, her eyes scanning the room frantically until they landed on her son. "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry." The doctor had so many questions. She rushed over, her relief palpable. She knelt down and hugged her son tightly, oblivious for a moment to the tense atmosphere she had just entered. She was Leo's mother, a woman whose exhaustion and love were written on her face in equal measure. She pulled back and looked at her son, then at the powerful-looking woman beside him, and finally at the stern, pale-faced man looming over them. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice filled with a mother's protective instinct. Mr. Harrison saw his chance, a way to reassert control. "Ma'am," he began, his tone shifting to one of officialdom, "I am the director here. We were just discussing your son's presence in this particular waiting area." He was trying to frame it as a procedural issue, a simple mix-up, but it was too late. The seed of injustice had been planted, and Eleanor Vance was about to make sure it bore fruit. Before Leo's mother could even process Mr. Harrison's officious tone, Eleanor spoke, her voice cutting through the tension with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Everything is fine," she said, looking directly at the worried mother with a gentle, reassuring smile. "Your son is a perfect gentleman. He and I were just getting acquainted." She then turned her gaze back to Mr. Harrison, and the ice returned. This man, however, was just explaining the clinic's policy on judging sick children by their appearance. It's been a most enlightening conversation. Leo's mother, whose name was Sarah, looked from Eleanor to the director, her brow furrowed in confusion. She was a single mother who worked 2 jobs to afford the consultations at this clinic, a place she had come to on the recommendation of a support group, praying for a miracle for her son. She had scrimped and saved, sold her late husband's car, and swallowed her pride 100 to give Leo this one shot. The last thing she had expected was to walk into a confrontation about her son's right to sit in a chair. "My son's presence?" she repeated, her voice trembling with a mix of confusion and rising anger. "What's wrong with his presence? He was just sitting here." Mr. Harrison, now cornered by 2 women, one a quietly furious powerhouse, and the other a fiercely protective mother, began to backpedal furiously. "There has been a misunderstanding," he insisted, wringing his hands slightly. "Our concern is always for the patient's comfort, always. I was simply inquiring to ensure the boy was not lost." The lie was so transparent it was insulting. Eleanor let the silence hang for a moment, allowing the absurdity of his excuse to fully marinate in the air. She watched him squirm, his carefully constructed authority dissolving under the weight of his own prejudice. "You were not inquiring," Eleanor stated flatly. "You were intimidating. You were humiliating a child who has more dignity in his little finger than you have in your entire, empty suit." The insult, a direct echo of her late husband's words, was delivered with such cold finality that it left no room for rebuttal. The vindicator had arrived, not in the form of a powerful spouse or a higher authority, but from within Eleanor herself. She had become her own enforcer of justice. At that moment, as if summoned by the dramatic tension, a woman in a crisp white lab coat entered the waiting area. It was Dr. Sterling 2b.com. Eris, the head of pediatric oncology. a woman renowned for her brilliance and her no-nonsense demeanor. Her eyes swept across the scene, taking in Mr. Harrison's panicked expression, Sarah's worried face, and Eleanor's resolute posture. "Mr. Harrison," Dr. Eris said, her voice sharp. "What is going on here? You're supposed to be comforting patients, not causing a scene." Mr. Harrison turned to the doctor, his face a mask of desperate relief. Here was an ally, another professional who understood the importance of order and protocol. "Dr. Eris, thank goodness. I was just handling a delicate situation. This family seems to be in the wrong area, and Ms. Vance here," he gestured towards Eleanor, "was concerned." He was trying to frame Eleanor as an over-emotional woman and Sarah as an out-of-place nuisance. It was a fatal mistake. Dr. Eris's gaze settled on Eleanor, and a flicker of recognition, followed by immense respect, dawned in her eyes. "Miss Vance," the doctor said, her tone shifting completely. "We weren't expecting you until this afternoon. I'm so sorry you've been troubled." The entire waiting room seemed to hold its breath. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place for everyone, except for the one person who mattered most. Mr. Harrison stared, dumbfounded. He knew the name Vance, Vance Technologies, the multi-billion-dollar corporation, the name on the pending acquisition file that had been sitting on his desk for a week. His mind raced, connecting the dots with horrifying speed. The unassuming woman in the simple cardigan, her quiet authority, her name. He had just spent the last 10 minutes condescending to the very person who was about to become his new boss. The woman who now owned the ground on which he stood. The color drained from Mr. Harrison's face, leaving behind a pasty gray mask of sheer panic. The tailored suit that had been his armor moments before now seemed like a ridiculous costume. He looked at Eleanor, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a simple woman but an immense, immovable force. The quiet confidence she radiated was not the passive contentment of old money. It was the profound stillness of absolute power. He had mistaken a dormant volcano for a gentle hill. "Miss Vance," he stammered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "Of Vance Technologies? I had no idea. I am so terribly sorry." The apology was not for his behavior towards a sick child, but for his failure to recognize her status. It was the most damning confession he could have made, revealing that his courtesy was a currency he spent only on the wealthy. Eleanor ignored him completely. She turned her attention to Dr. Eris, her expression softening. "Dr. Eris, it's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. My visit was meant to be anonymous, a simple observation before the final papers are signed this afternoon. But my observations, I'm afraid, have revealed a deep, systemic issue with the culture of this facility, personified by your Director of Patient Relations." Dr. Eris shot a look at Mr. Patient Harrison that could have curdled milk. Her professional relationship with the director had always been strained. She viewed him as a glorified hotel manager, more concerned with aesthetics than with patient care. Now, he had become a monumental liability. "I see," Dr. Eris said, her voice dangerously calm. "Mr. Harrison, my office, now." The director looked as if he might faint. He cast one last, pleading look at Eleanor, who met his gaze with an expression of utter indifference. He turned and walked away, his confident stride now a shuffling, defeated retreat. The shark had been defanged and declawed in full view of the entire aquarium. The other occupants of the waiting room quickly found renewed interest in their phones and magazines, a collective effort to become invisible, lest they too be judged by the woman who had so effortlessly dismantled the clinic's social hierarchy. Eleanor then knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with Leo. His wide blue eyes were filled with a mixture of awe and confusion. He didn't understand the corporate dynamics, the titles, or the money, but he understood what had just happened on a fundamental level. She had stood up for him. She had been his champion. "Leo," she said gently, her voice devoid of the icy edge it had held moments before, "I am very sorry for how that man treated you. No one, ever, has the right to make you feel like you don't belong." Sarah, his mother, stood by, tears welling in her eyes. She was overwhelmed by the turn of events. One moment, she was facing another soul-crushing humiliation, and the next, a guardian angel in a gray cardigan had appeared. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know who you are, but thank you." Eleanor rose and faced her, offering a genuine, warm smile. "My name is Eleanor Vance, and I believe I'm about to become the new owner of this hospital's pediatric wing, which means," she added, looking back down at Leo, "that you and Bartholomew are now my most important clients. And my first order of business is to ensure that my clients receive the best care in the world, starting right now." She extended her hand to Dr. Harris. "Doctor, I'd like to prepay for all of Leo's treatment, effective immediately. And I'd like to have a long talk with you about a new initiative, one focused on compassion and dignity for every single family that walks through these doors, regardless of what they're wearing or the size of their bank account." The reveal was complete. It was not a boastful display of power, but a quiet, decisive wielding of it for a purpose that was, for the first time in a long time, not about profit margins or market share. It was about a small boy with a one-eyed bear. Dr. Harris, a woman not easily impressed, looked at Eleanor with a newfound, profound respect. In her line of work, she dealt with wealthy benefactors constantly. They were often demanding, seeking naming rights and public accolades in exchange for their generosity. They wrote checks, but they rarely engaged with the human reality of the illnesses their money was supposed to fight. Eleanor Vance was different. She had not announced her presence with a press release. She had revealed her character through an act of quiet defiance and genuine compassion. "Ms. Vance," Dr. Harris said, shaking her hand firmly, "it would be my absolute honor. We can use my office. We have a lot to discuss." She then looked at Sarah and Leo with a warmth that transformed her professional demeanor. "Sarah, Leo, why don't you come with me? We'll get you settled in a private room, away from all this. And Leo, I have a feeling you and I are going to become very good friends." For the first time that day, a real bright smile spread across Leo's face. He looked at his mom, then at Eleanor, and then at the kind doctor. The intimidating, cold waiting room had suddenly become a place of hope. As Sarah gathered their things, still in a state of grateful disbelief, Eleanor felt a lightness in her chest she hadn't experienced since Richard was alive. It was the feeling of purpose, the quiet hum of making a tangible difference in someone's life. This was what Richard had always tried to tell her, that their wealth, their influence, was not a shield to hide behind, but a tool to be used, a lever to move the world, even if only for one small boy. The acquisition of the pediatric wing was no longer a sterile business transaction. It now had a face, a name, and a mission. It had a why. Later that day, in a sterile boardroom that felt a world away from the emotional landscape of the waiting room, Eleanor sat opposite a trembling Mr. Harrison. Her legal team was there, as was the hospital's board. The air was thick with unspoken fear. Mr. Harrison had spent the intervening hours in a cold sweat, imagining the end of his career. He began to speak, a pre-rehearsed torrent of apologies and excuses pouring out of him. "Ms. Vance, I cannot express my profound regret. It was a lapse in judgment, a complete misunderstanding of the situation. My record of service here has been exemplary. I was merely thinking of protocol." Eleanor held up a hand, and the flow of pathetic words ceased instantly. She let the silence stretch, her calm demeanor more unnerving than any tirade could have been. "Mr. Harrison," she said finally, her voice even and measured, "your apology is misdirected. You should not be apologizing to me for failing to recognize my net worth. You should be on your knees, apologizing to that little boy for failing to recognize his humanity. But you are incapable of that, because you don't see it as a failure. You see your mistake as a social blunder, not a moral one. That is the problem." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze pinning him in his chair. "You are not going to be fired." A flicker of desperate hope appeared in his eyes. "Instead," she continued, "your job description is about to change. You will be keeping your title as Director of Patient Relations. However, for the next 6 months, you will spend 4 hours of every day, not here in the pavilion, but volunteering in the free clinic downtown that we are also acquiring and funding. You will check people in, you will bring them water, you will sit with frightened children and comfort worried parents. You will learn what it means to serve, not to gatekeep. You will learn the names of people, not just their insurance providers, and Dr. Eris will be your direct supervisor, providing me with weekly reports on your progress. If, after 6 months, you have not learned the meaning of compassion, then you will be fired. This is not a punishment, Mr. Harrison. It is your education. Class is in session. The comeuppance was delivered not with rage, but with a chilling, constructive precision. It was not about revenge. It was about reform. It was a lesson, framed as an opportunity for redemption. An opportunity he had no choice but to accept. The 6 months that followed were transformative, not just for Mr. Harrison, but for the entire institution. Eleanor, true to her word, poured not just money but her soul into what became the Richard and Eleanor Vance Center for Pediatric Care. The name was her only concession to traditional philanthropy. Her real work was in changing the culture from the ground up. The sterile, intimidating waiting room was redesigned. The cold leather chairs were replaced with comfortable, colorful sofas. A play area was built, filled with books and toys. The imposing modern art was replaced with bright, cheerful murals painted by local student artists. The very air of the place began to change, from one of rarefied exclusivity to one of welcoming warmth. New policies were drafted, written by Eleanor herself. The first and most important rule was simple. Every child and every family will be treated with the utmost dignity, respect, and kindness, regardless of their background, appearance, or ability to pay. It was posted in large, friendly letters at the entrance. Eleanor became a regular, hands-on presence. She was no longer an anonymous benefactor. She knew the names of the nurses, the janitors, and most importantly, the children. She would often be found in the new waiting area, not in a suit, but in her simple cardigan, reading a story to a small group of patients. She had found her purpose not in a boardroom, but in the quiet, profound moments of human connection. Leo, under the expert care of Dr. Eris and her newly funded team, began to thrive. The best treatments, once a distant dream for his mother, were now at his disposal, but it was the emotional support that made the real difference. He was no longer a patient in a scary hospital. He was a cherished member of a community. Eleanor became a fixture in his life, a figure he came to call Auntie Elle. She attended his school plays, helped him with his homework via video calls when he was in treatment, and always listened. She taught him about business, and he taught her about the healing power of a well-timed hug for a one-eyed teddy bear. And Mr. Harrison? He began his education with a bitter, resentful heart. The first few weeks at the downtown clinic were a personal hell for him. The work was messy, the people were not from his world, and there was no deference, no status to hide behind. He was just a man in a polo shirt, handing out forms and cleaning up spilled juice. He was humbled, stripped of all the external markers of his identity. But slowly, something began to shift. He saw the raw courage of a single mother working 3 jobs to get her child a simple checkup. He held the hand of an elderly man who was terrified of needles. He made a little girl laugh by making a funny face, a spontaneous act of silliness he hadn't known he was capable of. He started to see the people, not their circumstances. He saw their fear, their hope, their resilience. One afternoon, a young family came in, clearly overwhelmed and scared. Their daughter was sick, and they had no insurance and spoke little English. The old Mr. Harrison would have seen a procedural nightmare. The new Mr. Harrison saw a family in need. He spent an hour with them, patiently using a translation app on his phone, guiding them through the paperwork, and personally walking them back to see the doctor. He brought the little girl a teddy bear from a donation bin, and her grateful smile was a greater reward than any bonus he had ever received. At the end of the 6 months, Dr. Harris's final report to Eleanor was simple. He's learning. Mr. Harrison was a changed man. He kept his job, but he was no longer a gatekeeper. he was a guide. A year after that fateful day in the waiting room, the Vance Center held a small celebration. It was not a grand gala for wealthy donors, but a sun-drenched afternoon party in the center's new rooftop garden for the patients and their families. The air was filled with laughter and the smell of hot dogs. Eleanor stood to one side, watching the scene with a quiet, contented smile. She was wearing her favorite gray cardigan. Leo, his hair now growing back thick and curly, ran past her, chasing a balloon. He was in remission, his prognosis excellent. He was, for all intents and purposes, a normal, healthy 8-year-old boy, full of life and mischief. His mother, Sarah, now worked for the center's foundation, helping other families navigate the often terrifying world of pediatric illness. Her experience and empathy made her invaluable. Eleanor had not just paid for Leo's treatment. She had given his family a future. Mr. Harrison was there too, manning the grill. He was wearing a ridiculous kiss-the-cook apron and was laughing, a genuine, unforced sound that reached his eyes. He was telling a bad joke to a group of children who were giggling hysterically. He caught Eleanor's eye from across the garden and gave her a small, respectful nod. It was a nod of thanks, not for sparing his job, but for saving his soul. Later, as the sun began to set, Eleanor found herself sitting on a bench next to Leo, who was carefully explaining the complex social hierarchy of his favorite cartoon characters to Bartholomew the bear. "Are you happy, Auntie Elle?" he asked, suddenly serious, his blue eyes searching her face. Eleanor looked out at the community she had built, at the children who were receiving a second chance, at the families who had found a haven of support. She thought of the cold, empty woman she had been just 1 year ago, lost in a fog of grief and meaningless transactions. She thought of Richard, and for the first time, the memory brought a pure, unadulterated warmth, not a stab of pain. She knew he would be proud. "Yes, Leo," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she no longer tried to suppress. "I'm very happy." The story of the boy in the waiting room became a quiet legend at the hospital. A modern parable whispered among the staff. It was a story about how a single moment of judgment can be a catalyst for profound change. It taught them that true wealth is not measured by what you have, but by what you give. It was a reminder that the most powerful person in the room is not always the one in the most expensive suit, but sometimes it's the person with the kindest heart. The experience had fundamentally rewired Eleanor's approach to her life and her business. Vance Technologies began investing heavily in socially responsible projects, from clean energy to educational programs in underserved communities. Her board of directors, initially skeptical, could not argue with the results. The company's public image soared, and employee morale reached an all-time high. People wanted to work for a company that stood for something more than just profit. Eleanor had discovered that compassion was not just good for the soul, it was good for business. She had learned the most valuable lesson of her life from a sick little boy and his one-eyed bear. You can't judge a book by its cover. And you can't measure a person's worth by the contents of their wallet. True value lies in our capacity for kindness, in our willingness to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, and in the quiet courage it takes to ask, "Can I sit here?" and truly listen to the answer. Have you ever witnessed a moment of unfair judgment? What happened next? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspirational tales that remind us of the power of a single act of kindness. Because you never know whose life you might change. It might even be your own. The ripple effect of that one encounter continued to spread in ways Eleanor could have never predicted. The story, picked up by a local news blog, went viral. It wasn't the details of the business acquisition that captured the public's imagination, but the simple human drama of the powerful CEO defending the sick child. People were tired of stories about greed and cynicism. They were hungry for a narrative of hope and decency. Donations to the Vance Center's foundation poured in from all over the world. Small $5 contributions from pensioners, large grants from other corporations inspired by Eleanor's example. The center was able to expand its services, offering free transportation for families, temporary housing for those who had to travel for treatment, and comprehensive mental health support for patients and their parents. It became a national model for compassionate healthcare, a beacon of what was possible when profit was no longer the sole driving force. Inspired by the public response, Eleanor launched the Bartholomew Initiative, a global project named after Leo's beloved bear. The initiative's goal was to fund and establish similar patient-first, compassion-centered pediatric care facilities in underserved communities around the globe. She traveled the world, not as a tourist or a detached executive, but as an advocate, meeting with local leaders, doctors, and families. She brought the same quiet dignity and fierce determination to these meetings as she had to the waiting room that day. She listened to their stories, understood their needs, and then deployed the full resources of her empire to help them. She was no longer just building a company, she was building a legacy Richard would have been astounded by. Her personal life also blossomed in unexpected ways. The walls she had built around her heart had not just been breached, they had been demolished. She reconnected with old friends she had pushed away in her grief. She learned to laugh again, to find joy in small things, a walk in the park, a shared meal, a sunset. The gray cardigan became her trademark, a symbol of her philosophy of quiet power. She became an icon, not for her wealth, but for her wisdom and her humanity. She gave speeches not from a teleprompter in a stuffy conference hall, but sitting on a simple stool, telling the story of Leo and Mr. Harrison. Her message was always the same. Look closer. See the person, not the label. Choose kindness. Leo, growing into a bright and empathetic young man, often joined her. He would stand beside her, a living testament to her message, and sometimes he would bring Bartholomew, whose missing button eye seemed like a wink to the world, a reminder that things don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. Mr. Harrison, for his part, became one of the initiative's most passionate advocates. He traveled to new facilities to train staff, not in bureaucratic procedures, but in the art of human connection. He shared his own story with unflinching honesty, using his past arrogance as a cautionary tale. His redemption was complete and profound. He had lost his status but had found his purpose. The story became more than just an inspirational anecdote. It became a movement. It sparked conversations in schools, in workplaces, and around dinner tables about prejudice, empathy, and the responsibility that comes with power. It reminded people that change doesn't always come from a sweeping revolution. Sometimes, it starts with a single, quiet question in a waiting room. It starts with the simple, courageous act of seeing another human being and offering them a place to sit. The final scene of this chapter of her life took place 10 years later. Eleanor, now in her late 50s, stood on a stage in a remote village in a developing nation. She was there to open the 20th Bartholomew Initiative Clinic. Beside her stood a tall, confident 18-year-old Leo, who was about to start medical school on a full scholarship from the Vance Foundation. In the front row, a graying but content Mr. Harrison watched, tears in his eyes. Eleanor looked out at the crowd of hopeful faces, and she didn't see strangers. She saw 1,000 Leos, 1,000 Sarahs, 1,000 opportunities to make a difference. Her speech was short and from the heart, ending with the words that had become her life's creed. Remember to always be kind. For everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And never, ever underestimate the power of a simple act of compassion. It can change a life. It can change a community. And as I have learned, it can change the world. The establishment of the 20th clinic was a milestone, a tangible symbol of a decade of relentless work. But for Eleanor, the true measure of success was never in the numbers, but in the individual lives touched. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and the celebratory music faded, she walked through the new facility with Leo. It was small but immaculately clean, designed with the same principles of warmth and welcome as the flagship center back home. The walls were painted with vibrant murals of local folklore. A touch, Leo had suggested, insisting that a place of healing should feel like it belonged to the community it served. He had a wisdom far beyond his years, a deep well of empathy forged in the crucible of his own childhood illness. "He would be so proud of you, Auntie Elle," Leo said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. He didn't need to say the name. Richard was a constant, gentle presence in their shared story. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "He would be proud of us, Leo," she corrected him. "This was never just my journey. You were the one who woke me up." You and Bartholomew, Leo laughed, a rich, full sound that filled the hallway. Bartholomew is the real hero. He never judged anyone, even with only one eye to see with. They stopped in front of the pediatric waiting room. It was empty now, but in the morning, it would be filled with anxious parents and sick children. But unlike the waiting room where she and Leo had met, this one was designed to soothe, not to intimidate. There were small chairs, shelves of books in the local language, and a large, soft rug on the floor. It was a space built on the memory of humiliation, transformed into a sanctuary of hope. Eleanor ran her hand along the smooth wood of a small rocking chair. "It's funny," she mused. "I spent the first half of my life building an empire of technology, of code and circuits. I thought that was my legacy, but all of it, every patent, every product, every bit of profit, it was all just a prelude. It was the raw material for this." She turned to Leo, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "This is the legacy, the kindness, the second chances." A young nurse, a local woman who had been trained through a Vance Foundation scholarship, approached them hesitantly. "Ms. Vance? There is a man here to see you. He says it's important." Eleanor, surprised, followed the nurse to the entrance. An older, weather-beaten man stood there, twisting a worn hat in his hands. He was a local farmer, and his eyes held a look of profound gratitude. He spoke in his native tongue, and the nurse translated. "He says his daughter was one of the first children treated by your visiting doctors, even before the clinic was built," the nurse explained. "She had a fever you helped diagnose as a serious infection. He has no money to repay you, but he wanted to give you this." The farmer held out a small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was a simple, humble gift, but it was beautiful, crafted with hours of patient labor. He pressed it into Eleanor's hands. At that moment, Eleanor Vance, the billionaire CEO, the titan of industry, felt a sense of wealth that dwarfed anything in her bank accounts. She held the small bird as if it were the most precious jewel in the world. She looked at the farmer and bowed her head slightly, a universal gesture of respect and thanks. No translator was needed. It was a connection that transcended language and culture, a simple, profound moment of shared humanity. As the farmer left, Leo came to stand beside her. "See," he said gently, "it's always the little things, isn't it?" Eleanor closed her hand around the wooden bird, its smooth surface a comfort against her palm. She had started this journey to honor her husband's memory, but somewhere along the way, she had found her own salvation. She was no longer a widow hiding from the world, she was a force for good within it. The story was not about her power, or her money, or her fame. It was about what she chose to do with it. It was a story that proved that the greatest return on any investment is the one you make in another human being. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life, a lesson that began with a sick little boy and a simple, life-changing question. Can I sit here? The answer, she now knew, should always, always be yes. The wooden bird became one of Eleanor's most prized possessions. It sat on her desk, beside photos of Richard and a smiling, healthy Leo, a constant reminder that the most valuable things in life are not bought, but earned through connection and given from the heart. Her journey into philanthropy had reshaped her entire corporate philosophy. Vance Technologies, once a symbol of relentless, cutting-edge capitalism, became a pioneer of a new model: compassionate capitalism. The concept was simple, but revolutionary. Every business decision was filtered through a primary question: will this do good in the world? The company began investing in sustainable technologies, creating fair-wage jobs in developing nations, and ensuring its products were accessible and beneficial. Skeptics in the financial world predicted disaster. But the opposite happened. The company attracted the best and brightest talent, people who wanted to work for a mission, not just a paycheck. Customer loyalty became fiercely strong. People didn't just buy Vance products, they believed in the Vance ethos. Profits grew, not despite their ethical stance, but because of it. Eleanor had proven that a company could have a soul and still be wildly successful. She had learned that the heart and the bottom line were not mutually exclusive. Leo's journey into medicine was fueled by a deep-seated desire to pay forward the kindness that had saved his life. He excelled in his studies, not just in the science of medicine, but in the art of it. He spent his summers volunteering at the Bartholomew Initiative clinics, learning from doctors and nurses on the front lines. He had a natural gift for connecting with patients, especially children. He understood their fear because he had lived it. He knew that a reassuring word or a shared moment of laughter could be just as healing as any medicine. He often said that Dr. Eris had cured his body, but Auntie L had healed his spirit. His specialty, naturally, was pediatric oncology, and he became a leading voice in advocating for holistic, patient-centered care. He and Eleanor co-authored a best-selling book titled Can I Sit Here?, which shared their story and laid out a blueprint for a more compassionate world in healthcare, business, and everyday life. The book's proceeds went entirely to the foundation, creating a self-sustaining cycle of giving. And what of the ripple's origin? The Sterling Medical Pavilion, once a bastion of sterile elitism, was now barely recognizable. Under the continued guidance of a reformed Mr. Golden, HolidVer7.com, Harrison and the watchful eye of Dr. Eris, it had become the crown jewel of the Vance Healthcare Network. It was a place where cutting-edge medical technology and profound human empathy coexisted. The infamous waiting room was now a historical curiosity, a story told to new employees as a lesson in what not to be. The culture of judgment had been replaced by a culture of service. One day, an elderly Eleanor, her hair now a soft silver, was visiting the center. She was walking through the halls, no entourage, no announcement, just observing the quiet, efficient compassion that was now the norm. A young, nervous-looking couple was trying to soothe a crying toddler. They looked overwhelmed and lost. A nurse immediately approached them, not with a clipboard, but with a warm smile and a gentle voice. The nurse knelt down, spoke softly to the child, and in a matter of moments, the crying subsided. The nurse then calmly guided the parents, answering their questions with patience and kindness. Eleanor watched from a distance, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. This was it. This was the legacy in action. It was not a grand gesture, but a small, everyday act of decency, repeated 1,000 times over. It was the system working as it should, the culture she had fought to build, now breathing on its own. The world was still an imperfect place, filled with inequality and casual cruelty. But in this small corner, and in dozens of corners like it around the globe, a different story was being told. It was a story that affirmed that one person can make a difference, that a single act of standing up for what is right can echo through years and across continents. It was a testament to the enduring power of a simple, human connection. A power that could transform a grieving widow into a global changemaker, a condescending bureaucrat into a compassionate leader, and a sick little boy into a beacon of hope for generations to come. All because he dared to ask for a place to sit, and she dared to say yes.